Thought for the day. The question isn't why they keep doing it, but rather why you keep allowing it.
Welcome to 7 Minutes for Yourself. I'm Christina Aina, and I'm so glad you've joined me for what I believe will be 7 of the most enriching minutes of your day. Let's take this time to reconnect with ourselves and improve our well-being.
In today's episode of 7 Minutes for Yourself, we discuss the importance of communicating what we are okay with and what we aren't. Have a listen.
Let's talk about what not to do when setting boundaries. First, ask them to change the way that they interact with you and think you're done. Boundaries are not the same as requests. A request is a forceful ask or demand that someone change their behavior. For example, I may say to someone, "Please don't speak to me that way," or "Please don't comment on my body." Those are requests. And it's a very important part of setting a boundary. But the key word there is part. Often I see people make that statement and then think that they're done, that that's all the work they had to do when setting boundaries. But a boundary is about managing your behavior. And so it includes one more thing. It includes a plan for what you're going to do to keep yourself safe and healthy if someone crosses that boundary. Think about it this way. You happen upon a field and there's a gate. That feels like a boundary to some of us. We would never dream of crossing that without being invited in, right? That's private property. I'm not going to trespass. But let's be honest, boundaries are not for people like that. Boundaries are for people who might think to themselves, I could probably cut through this field on my ways to get somewhere. They barely even notice the gate. So a boundary is more than that fence or gate. It's also got a sign on it that says, trespassers will be prosecuted. This is now not only a barrier, but a plan for how to enforce that barrier. That's what you need in your boundaries. So you may ask someone to change their behavior and then think to yourself, well, what's my plan if they don't? Sometimes you might include that in your communication. For example, "Please don't speak to me that way," or "I'll have to get off the phone with you." Or if you're saying, "Please don't comment on my body," and if you aren't able to honor that request, "I'll have to take a break from eating meals with you." Sometimes that second part might just be a plan in your mind. We don't always have to communicate it. But either way, don't just make a request and think that you're done. The second big thing not to do when you're setting boundaries is to focus on trying to change someone else's behavior. This is a biggie. Boundaries are not about trying to change how someone else is behaving. Of course, in the dream world, when I ask someone to stop doing something, the end result is that they stop doing it. And it's very easy to think about boundaries this way. I'm setting this boundary to get them to stop. But unfortunately, that's not always how it works. And when we focus on changing someone else's behavior as the goal of a boundary, we're stepping out of what we can control. And we might end up feeling helpless and powerless because we can't control what other people do. And boundaries are not about feeling hopeless or helpless. They're about empowerment. They are about taking back what you can control, which are your choices and your behavior. Sometimes when we set boundaries and someone gets upset, we feel like we've failed. That boundary didn't work. They're mad at us. Or if someone pushes against a boundary, it feels like it didn't work either. But boundaries are in place for when people won't stop. That's what they're there for. And that isn't them not working. That's the chance to implement your boundary by changing your behavior to keep yourself safe and healthy. The third thing we want to try not to do when setting boundaries is to have all or nothing boundaries. For some reason, love black, white, all or nothing, in or out. We're like drawn to it. And some of us are hunting for relationships where we won't have to have boundaries because we don't really like setting them. But boundaries are not just for unhealthy dynamics and relationships. Boundaries are for every relationship. If you have a relationship that doesn't need any boundaries, sorry to say that's not healthy. That might actually be a sign of the infatuation stage of an enmeshed, maybe codependent, or just unhealthy dynamic. And if we struggle with boundaries, we set our boundary as all or nothing. We want no boundaries, and then we realize we need them. And then people aren't abiding by what we think we need, and then we just decide to cut them off altogether. And we call that cutting off a boundary. We tell ourselves we're being healthy by totally cutting off connection with someone, when the truth is we're sometimes doing that because we don't know how to set and uphold boundaries. It's too hard for us to grow in identifying and communicating what we're okay with and what we aren't. And we don't want the emotional discomfort of having to navigate that in relationships, so we would just rather end it. In healthy relationships, boundaries change and shift based on needs and responses. And in healthy boundaries, we are able to invite people into areas where they're safe and set boundaries where we need them. And here are some examples, just in case you're having a hard time visualizing what I'm talking about. Let's say you're struggling to set boundaries at work. Let's see how these three things, the three things to not do, might play out. First, maybe you ask them to change the way they interact with you and you think you're done. So you put together an email and you send it to your boss and you let them know, hey, please don't text me in the evening after work. Instead of just doing that, you could try letting them know, hey, if you text at night after work hours or on the weekend, I'm not going to be able to get back to you until the next work day. You can see how that could be a little more impactful. Second, and I know that may be so stressful for some of you, because if they still text you at night, you can get really frustrated. Like, the boundary isn't working. I told them and it's just not working at all. But remember, the goal of the boundary isn't to control them or their behavior. The boundary is about you not responding, right? Not responding to the text on weekends after work.
That concludes today's episode of 7 Minutes for Yourself. Please take a moment to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts. Today and every day with your kiddo is a gift. Enjoy it. Thanks for tuning in.